The story begins with Jung Yang, the protagonist, who was completely frustrated in front of his computer screen. He stared at the monitor with a frown, unable to contain his annoyance. He had bet, hoping that this time would be his chance to make a little extra money. However, not having won, his anger was becoming more evident. The man muttered quietly, cursing the online casinos that, according to him, had taken his money with exasperating ease. With nothing else to do at that moment, he collapsed into his chair, exhausted and disappointed, feeling a mix of boredom and disillusionment for having lost yet again. In the end, he decided it would be best to go out into the hallway for a while to clear his head, maybe smoke a cigarette and shake off his frustration. He got up slowly, his movements reflecting his lack of enthusiasm, and headed towards his room door, wondering if anyone else would be around. When he opened the door and took a step into the hallway, something caught his attention. There, stuck to his door, was a note written in the unmistakable handwriting of his landlord. Jung leaned in to read it more closely. The message reminded him that he had until the weekend to pay the rent. The warning was clear, and worries began to arise in his mind. How am I supposed to get that money in such a short time? He thought, feeling a growing pressure in his chest. He decided to go outside, and while looking up at the sky, he couldn't help but think about how different everything would have been if he had won that last bet. With those funds, he could have at least covered the rent for the month without having to worry. Jung Yang was someone who preferred to keep to himself, a true recluse. He didn't care much about socializing or forming connections. Instead, he had grown accustomed to living within the walls of his room, finding a sort of solace in his solitude. This was who he was, a 32-year-old unemployed man who had completely isolated himself from society. He had spent 2 years avoiding contact with people, and though he had once dreamed of a promising future, circumstances led him to distrust others and retreat into himself. "Do you wonder if I feel lonely or bored?" "Maybe a little," he said. After all, he hadn't lived this way for very long. Once there was a spark of hope in his life, where he envisioned a bright future, a path full of opportunities. But things started to go wrong, and a series of unfortunate events pulled him into a darkness he no longer knew how to escape. How could I trust people again after all that happened? At that very moment, the protagonist heard a noise that grabbed his full attention. It was a soft, familiar sound, and when he turned his head, he found a cat meowing nearby, looking at him with that calm, indifferent gaze only cats seem to have. He smiled slightly, recognizing his unexpected companion, a non-human friend who had become his only company in those lonely times. It was curious how this little animal would listen to him without a single complaint, without judgment, simply being there. And in a way, that gave him some peace. He crouched a bit to speak to the cat, and with a mix of irony and sadness, commented that it seemed much happier than he was. "Look at you, so calm, so at peace, while I, on the other hand, feel like I've lost everything," he said in a low voice. In a burst of honesty, he confessed to the cat that he had been so desperate about his problems that he'd even thought of ending it all. "Isn't that ridiculous?" he continued, laughing without much energy. He told the cat how he had lost money gambling, which he himself considered his last bad decision of the day, and explained that he didn't even have enough to buy it a treat. "Sorry, buddy, I owe you one," he said, gently petting the cat's head. The cat had appeared in his usual smoking spot about a month ago, and had since become his only pleasant routine. It must be friendly with humans, he thought, since it didn't run away when he approached or even when he petted it. It was on an ordinary day when he first started talking to it, not thinking much of it, and before he knew it, these daily conversations with his feline friend had become almost sacred to him. It was a presence without a voice, without opinions, but somehow it was incredibly freeing to talk to it, as if simply saying his thoughts out loud was enough to relieve him. And really, why would he have to talk only to humans? Maybe that's what he liked most about the cat's company. After all, it didn't ask anything of him, didn't offer opinions, just stayed there. As he stroked the cat, he began telling it about his morning, how he'd gotten up early to check the games and place a bet that he now saw as another mistake. In another part of the building, in a nearby room, a girl heard the protagonist's voice as he calmly talked to the cat. Curious, she moved closer to the window to see him better, and upon recognizing him, let out a small sigh, wondering what might have happened to that man who always spoke to himself. Some time ago, she had started noticing how he would talk to the animal about trivial things at first, like the weather or the day in general. But then it changed, and he began sharing more personal, deeper things. For him, it was simply a daily ramble, a space where he could tell that four-legged friend everything, a friend who, unknowingly, had earned his trust. Perhaps because it wasn't human, or maybe because its silence was comforting, Jung found something special in the company of that cat. After spending some time talking and releasing his worries, He bid it goodbye with a faint smile, promising that next time he wouldn't forget to bring some treats to make up for the chat. Suddenly, a girl ran quickly past him, like a flash breaking the tranquility of the moment. Jung watched her in disbelief, completely surprised by the unexpected appearance. At first, their eyes met briefly, and she also seemed taken aback to see him there, as if she had been expecting to meet him. Without saying a word, in an almost instinctive move, the girl took a step towards him and, without warning, leaned her head on his chest, visibly blushing and breathing heavily. Jung began to feel his nerves take over, noticing that his body was shaking slightly, and the confusion quickly turned into fear when he realized that this was indeed a real person so close to him. He tried to step back, distancing himself from her, and stammered as he asked who she was and why she was doing that. His mind was in chaos, trying to find some logical explanation for what was happening, but all he felt was intense discomfort. The girl, on her part, didn't respond. Instead, she covered her face with both hands, blushing even more as if she couldn't face the situation. Still bewildered, Jung tried to explain that he hadn't meant to scare her. Awkwardly, he told her that she had appeared so suddenly, which was why he had stepped back so quickly. His voice sounded tense and nervous, and despite his words, he couldn't help feeling uncomfortable interacting with someone so closely. It had been so long since he had been around people that he didn't really know how to act in this kind of situation. Finally, the girl raised her gaze, still blushing, and began to mumble an apology, visibly embarrassed by what had happened. However, before she could say much, Jung decided that it would be best to leave as soon as possible, not really knowing why. He quickly apologized, turned on his heels, and ran in the opposite direction, eager to get away from the situation as fast as he could. From behind, the girl watches him walk away, and with a mix of surprise and frustration, asks him to wait. Her voice barely reaches him as Ewan is already far away. The girl then turns her attention to the cat watching her calmly from the ground, and, with a warm smile, calls him by name as if he were an old friend. Meanwhile, Ewan has returned to the safety of his room, but his mind remains trapped in what just happened. He can't help but wonder who that girl was, and what reasons she might have had for approaching him. Could she have come to complain about him smoking there? He quickly dismisses that thought, as he rarely sees anyone in that alley. It was generally a lonely spot, perfect for someone who wanted to be alone. But now, with this stranger's intrusion, he feels his refuge has been invaded. Finally, he decides that it might be best to find another place where he can smoke peacefully, without worrying about running into unexpected people. But then a thought unsettles him, and the cat wonders, does this mean I won't be able to see him again? What will happen to his only companion? The uncertainty keeps him immersed in his thoughts, lost in the possibilities of how his daily routine might change. At that moment, a female voice interrupts his contemplation, and Ewan starts. He quickly turns around, searching for the source of the voice, his heart pounding. In front of him stands the same girl from before, standing in his room. She was surprisingly beautiful, with an elegant and shapely body that complemented an angelic and serene face. In her arms, she held the cat, who looked at him with an indifferent expression, as if everything were completely normal. Ewan carefully observes the cat in the girl's arms, and soon realizes that it is indeed the same cat from the alley, his silent companion with whom he used to share his deepest thoughts and secrets. The animal looks at him with the same calm expression as always, oblivious to the discomfort Ewan feels at that moment. The girl begins to apologize. Her tone is soft and slightly uncertain. "It wasn't my intention to scare you," she says quickly, looking at him directly but with flushed cheeks. Her nervousness is evident, as if she finds it hard to find the right words. She pauses, takes a deep breath, and continues. "I don't know where to start, but there's something I've wanted to ask you for a while, something I was afraid to leave unsaid. I thought that if I didn't do it today, I might not have another chance to talk to you." The young woman looks at him intently before asking the question she seems to have been holding. "Do you like cats?" Her voice cracks a little at the end of the sentence as if she fears his response. She introduces herself as Nar, saying, "I am a young woman of 25 and the owner of the cat." Ewan is completely perplexed, his thoughts tangled in the strangeness of what he's just heard. Unable to react, he quickly closes the door to his room without even responding to the girl. On the other side of the door, Nara starts, surprised by the sudden movement, and after a moment, she stands still in the hallway, feeling a bit confused. If you like what you're hearing, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more narrations and activate the bell to make sure you don't miss any new episodes. Hours later, after falling onto his bed and dozing off, Ewan wakes up, still a bit dazed, and his thoughts return to the girl and what she had said. He wonders, who was that young woman really, and why had she asked something as simple as whether he liked cats? He still remembers Nara's words freshly. She had wanted to talk to him for some time. This deeply unsettles him. We've barely exchanged a few words, but she acts like she knows me. Could we have crossed paths before on another occasion? Suddenly, his stomach growls, reminding him that he hasn't eaten all day. With a sigh, he decides it would be best to go to the nearby convenience store and get something to calm his hunger. Yet, deep down, he can't help but think of Nara and the cat as if they were a mystery he cannot solve. As he opens the door, he sees Nara outside, sitting against the wall, and he gives a small jump of surprise. The girl also starts at seeing him, and for a moment, both stand there in silence, looking at each other, not knowing what to do. Confusion seizes Ewan, who impulsively closes the door again immediately. Ewan, still bewildered, after a few seconds of uncomfortable silence, blurts out the words without thinking. "What do you want? Have you been standing there all this time?" His tone is somewhat abrupt, and his expression shows a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. In response to his question, the girl lowers her gaze as if suddenly feeling ashamed and replies with a slight stutter. Nara, still somewhat trembling, tries to gather the courage to continue and starts to introduce herself formally, almost as if following a script. "My name is Nar Song," she murmurs with a still hesitant voice and adds that she is 25 years old. Trying to maintain composure, she pulls out her phone and looks at it as if she might find the courage or exact words on the screen. With a slight sigh, Nara explains that she moved into the building's basement less than a month ago. "The place where you're smoking," she explains with a certain shyness, "is right next to my room window, so I know you by sight since you arrived." She pauses, her gaze slightly lost, and adds that the reason she is there today has to do with her cat. Ewan, listening with some disbelief, can't help but question her story. The girl explains that the cat he talked to every afternoon is actually hers. "His name is General," she adds with a slight nervous smile. Hearing this, Ewan begins to wonder silently if the feline wasn't as stray as he had thought. After all, the animal had a strange tendency to follow people confidently, as if used to human contact. Without waiting long, Ewan interrupts her, a bit impatient. "And what do you mean by all this? Are you going to ask me to take care of your cat or something?" he asks sarcastically. Nara, who seems affected by his brusqueness, begins to stammer, struggling to find the words. But before she can explain, he interrupts her again. "Well, no," he says quickly, cutting off any attempt at conversation, and without giving her a break. Ewan starts to grow impatient and, with a stern look, warns her that if she continues to bother him, he won't hesitate to call the police. Hearing this, Nara is startled, and her eyes begin to fill with tears. Between sobs, she desperately starts to apologize, explaining that talking to others has always been difficult for her. "I'm sorry, truly. I'm not good at talking in front of people," she murmurs, trying to calm herself, though her tears don't stop. Feeling increasingly overwhelmed, she insists between sobs, begging him to at least listen to her one time. Ewan, observing the scene, feels perplexed. He had never expected that this girl, who seemed so reserved, would break down in tears in front of him. The situation leaves him speechless, and he can't help but think that perhaps he had been too abrupt. As Nara continues to apologize, she explains that her cat General is very special to her, and that he had never shown interest in anyone else before except for her. "I could compensate you as much as I'm able," Nara says through her tears, her voice broken but determined. "Could you please listen to my request just this once?" Ewan nods, though he makes it clear that he has one condition. "Fine, I'll listen to you," he replies, softening his tone a little. "But speak quickly." Later, Ewan found himself in Nara's room, feeling somewhat uncomfortable with the situation. He looked around the space with curiosity, still wondering how he ended up agreeing to take care of a cat. At that moment, the feline began to approach him confidently, as if he already considered him part of the routine. Nara, with evident tenderness, lifted her pet and began to pet it gently, her hands gliding over the cat's fur with a delicacy that showed how much she cared for him. Standing in front of her, Ewan watched the scene, feeling a bit embarrassed. He had agreed to take care of the cat, and though the idea seemed a bit strange, the promise of payment kept him there, trying to hide his discomfort while blushing. He stammered a few words, trying to sound casual. "So I just have to come down for a bit and play with him, right?" Nara nodded with a gentle smile and explained that, besides playing, the cat had his own daily activities. "General usually has lunch and then goes out for a walk for a while," she commented while stroking the cat's head. She indicated that to make things easier, he could simply open the window to the room since the cat was used to going out and coming back on his own that way. Hearing this, Ewan looked toward the window, noticing it opened directly into the alley where he usually went to smoke. The coincidence struck him as odd, making him wonder for a moment if it was really a coincidence. Though he had agreed to care for the cat, something bothered him. He felt there were important details he didn't entirely understand. While he was absorbed in his thoughts, he suddenly felt a hand on his shoulder. Nara had touched him to get his attention, and he immediately blushed. He gave a small start of surprise, which also startled her. Still, he couldn't help but feel a bit concerned. Although he understood that Nara was only looking for someone to take care of her cat, it seemed somewhat unsettling that she had given her room's password to a complete stranger. "Aren't you worried that you gave it to a man you barely know?" he asked seriously. Nara began to stammer, not quite knowing how to respond. Her nervousness was evident, and her cheeks turned a reddish tone that clearly showed her discomfort. Ewan realized he might have been too direct, so he tried to downplay it. "Forget it. If anything weird happens, don't suspect me," he joked, trying to lighten the mood. Nara didn't say anything in response. She just looked at him steadily, with a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude in her eyes. Meanwhile, Ewan remembered that, due to his lack of money, he really needed to accept this job, strange as it was. He had lost everything in bets, and this was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. Suddenly, the cat, restless in Nara's arms, began to move vigorously, trying to get down from the shoulder where he was perched. With each small jump and movement, his claws unintentionally caught in the zipper of Nara's jacket, pulling at it until the zipper slid down, leaving her jacket wide open. Unexpectedly, Nara was left partially exposed, showing her curves in an obvious way. That scene left Ewan completely astonished, paralyzed in place as surprise washed over him. His eyes widened, and though he tried to look away, he couldn't quite manage to do so. He felt uncomfortable, but the shock kept him watching for an instant, trapped in the situation before he could react. Meanwhile, Nara, realizing what was happening, quickly covered herself, her face turning an intense red, more embarrassed than ever. A feeling of panic seized her, and she let out a small, desperate cry, trying to fix her jacket as quickly as possible. Ewan, seeing her like that, couldn't bear the embarrassment that flooded over him, and unable to control his own blush, he decided to leave quickly, his face completely red. Outside, while he tried to calm himself, he couldn't prevent his mind from returning to what he had just seen. In the silence of the hallway, he questioned how he had ended up in such a peculiar situation, and he couldn't deny that Nara's features were impressive. It wasn't something he wanted to think about, but the images slipped into his head. Inside the room, Nara, completely flushed and with tears in her eyes, sank down. She gently petted the cat, who looked at her innocently, not understanding the turmoil he had caused. "Why did you do that to me, General?" she whispered, almost as if the feline could understand her. She felt as if all her efforts to gather courage for an entire month had been in vain. Every night she had practiced in her mind what she would say to Ewan, trying to prepare the right words. And now, after the recent incident, she felt like she had made a fool of herself. How could she look him in the eyes after this? Shame enveloped her, and without knowing how to act, she stayed there, lost in her thoughts, searching for some way to remedy what had happened.